Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to have the opportunity to be here with all of you this afternoon and talking about this topic. And as we begin talking about the ins and outs of math anxiety, we're going to focus on what it is, as well as what can we do about it. I wanted to share how I became interested in this topic and my journey in investigating the work on math anxiety. And as I do that, I would be very interested to know what you are hoping to learn from this session. So as I'm talking about how I've gotten here and learned about math anxiety, I would love for you to drop something in the chat that says why you are interested or what you are interested in knowing following the end of this session. So with that, I will check the chat as you proceed to drop that answer to that question in. And I'm going to talk to you about how I became interested and invested in this topic over the last 5 years or so. So my journey in math anxiety and the work related to math anxiety began when I was at the University of Minnesota. I was teaching about the application of MTSS to math and focusing on that framework. And my students had me for content courses as well as practicum courses. And our assignments that we were requiring, some of our students were unable to accomplish. These were things like screening, progress monitoring, and these were all challenging for our students to be able to complete because many of these practices were being abandoned despite reliable, valid measures that had been proven with over 50 years of research. In addition, schools were abandoning existing curriculum and making up their own from publicly available books or popular press books that were being just published on the general market. And we've noticed that schools were stopping the provision of productive practice activities, so including timed activities. Much of this was being done, we discovered, my students and I, in the name of math anxiety. So my doctoral students suggested that we start digging into the literature on math anxiety if we were going to effectively look at the evidence-based practices that could be used. We needed to understand the rationale for why so many of the practices that we thought were effective and useful under this framework of MTSS as it is applied to math were being abandoned. And so I'm seeing lots of activity in the chat, and I appreciate that so much. I'm going to try to figure out here. Okay. So a lot of you are looking just to feel more strong in math and to learn more about math and math anxiety, understanding how it increases or changes over the years, looking at it, whether it comes across as I don't care and what does it look like. What actually contributes to math anxiety and what it does not. That might be one of my favorite recommendations. That's exactly what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how to build effective classroom structures, how to address students who experience more or need more intensive supports when it comes to math and math anxiety. I see other people saying techniques to help a variety of learners, exactly what it is. So this is wonderful. I'm so delighted you're here because I think I'm going to tackle many of the questions that you all have when it comes to this topic, which, as many of you know, because you're here, we don't have a lot of information about that seems very consistent. So we're going to also spend some time talking about what we really do understand and know well about this topic. So we have 4 objectives today, and I think based on the chat responses that I was able to review, I'm going to be addressing what you are looking for to some extent here today. So I'm really excited about that. We're going to define math anxiety, and I think that's really important as a basic starting point. We are also going to spend a lot of time talking about the relationship between math anxiety and math performance. This is something that we actually do know quite a bit about in terms of correlational research. And this has been an aspect of math anxiety that has been well investigated, which puts us in a good position to have some good ideas about what to do to mitigate math anxiety. So we're going to talk about this 2 different ways. We're going to talk about mitigating math anxiety in the classroom, and we're going to talk about mitigating math anxiety when designing interventions. So our first place that we're going to begin is defining math anxiety. So what it is, what umbrellas it falls under or is related to, and maybe what it's not. So math anxiety refers to feelings of apprehension, tension, or fear that interfere with performance on math-related tasks. Math anxiety can make it difficult to solve math problems in the classroom, but it also will affect individuals in real-world contexts. So, for example, calculating a tip or figuring out tax. And it has a lot of implications. So the reason it matters why we know about math anxiety is that students who experience high levels of math anxiety are less likely to take advanced math courses in high school and make STEM career choices. And this really matters because we know that competence in math is fundamental to science and engineering careers, which of course are predicted to outpace general job growth 3 to 1 and typically pay more. Students who take higher level math and science courses in high school are more likely to attend college and complete and earn bachelor's and associate's degrees than students without math anxiety or with math anxiety, and they are more likely to have higher math competence, and higher math competence leads to higher paying jobs. So there are long-term economic consequences if we don't address the impact of math anxiety. So these consequences have been documented both in the math performance arena, but they've also been documented along this math anxiety arena too. We also know that math anxiety is multifaceted. So as you think about what math anxiety is and the experience of math anxiety, you can think about it in terms of 2 dimensions. There is a cognitive dimension, which reflects worry, negative expectations, self-deprecating thoughts, and all of that is around math situations. The other component to it is this physiological and emotional dimension, which includes things like dread, unpleasant physical sensations that are associated with math sensations or situations. It is things like sweaty palms, rapid heartbeat, stomach not feeling well, I've heard people saying they feel fluttery in their legs. So all of these contribute to math anxiety, this cognitive dimension, which is about worry and negative thoughts, as well as this physical and emotional component. And both of these components contribute to attempts to escape or avoid math activities. And we'll spend more time talking about this cycle that ends up occurring later on in our session today. It's also important to understand what math anxiety is not. So we do know that math anxiety is related to the other forms of anxiety, so social anxiety, generalized anxiety, but it is distinct from those. So it is also distinct from things like test anxiety and statistics anxiety. So it's related to stats and test anxiety, but it is a very different phenomenon, and it doesn't, so it's important that we understand that there is a connection, but they are substantial differences as well. Test anxiety is specific to evaluative situations, such that the impact of math anxiety depends on the pressure or stress of the testing environment, and it constitutes fear or worry of negative outcomes due to failure or poor performance when faced with an assessment. And then there's statistics anxiety, which describes apprehension that an individual experiences in instructional situations, also in evaluative contexts when it's related to statistics, or when worrying about statistical tasks. It is enduring and it's a habitual form of anxiety, and students tend to report statistics anxiety over the course of their statistics education. So what math anxiety is not is test anxiety, and it's not statistics anxiety, and it's not generalized anxiety or social anxiety, although related to each of these components in the sense that it's an anxiety form. What's really important and specific about math anxiety is that it is around engaging in academic and daily life activities that involve math. The other thing as we start to unpack and understand what math anxiety is looking at what the prevalence of math anxiety may be. So prevalence has been something that is a little bit elusive, especially when it comes to talking about children and youth, which is what we'll talk about in a moment. But when we think about adults, there is some data that suggests that 93% of the US population experience or report experiencing some form of math anxiety. It's important to keep in mind that may not be high math anxiety, it just might be anxiety in general around math activities or tasks. And 17% of the US population experiences high levels of math anxiety, according to reports. And then there was a survey that demonstrated that as many as 1 in 4 teachers actually feel anxious engaging in math. So I think that's another important contextual piece to understanding how math anxiety might be impacting the educational experience. Although prevalence rates among K-12 students in the US is largely unknown, and as you will see, some of these data actually come from the international community, math anxiety has been detected in children as young as 6. 59% of adolescents around the world have reports on the PISA, which is the Program for International Student Assessment. The PISA is a measurement of 15-year-olds' ability to use their mathematics knowledge and skills to meet real-life challenges. So when taking that test, these students around the world were asked these questions about math. So they indicated as many as 59% of adolescents around the world worry math class will be difficult, and 31% report feeling very nervous when computing math problems. And there was a separate survey that actually, again, looked at teachers in the United States and illustrated that teachers were reporting math anxiety was a significant classroom challenge. And by that, it was presuming the students in their classroom were experiencing math anxiety. So again, this is the kid-centered data that we have available to us. It is also the case that math anxiety, when we look at whether it's adult or child and youth prevalence, that it is considered to be a global phenomenon. So it exists across cultures and across countries around the world. One of the things that we're going to talk about broadly, and then I'll talk about more specifically as we move throughout our session today, is what math anxiety actually impacts. Math anxiety, we know, impacts math performance, and I have a whole section where we're going to unpack what that means and what it looks like. We do know that students with high levels of math anxiety tend to exhibit lower levels of math performance than students that do not have high levels of math anxiety. We also know that students with math anxiety have lower self-concept and self-efficacy in math. They are less persistent and tend to engage less in math tasks. As I mentioned earlier, they are more likely to be task avoidant. They also tend to display less adaptive motivational frameworks. So instead of spending time engaging in tasks to learn more, these students are more motivated to engage in easy tasks and get a lot right. Than spend time on that harder content and material. And there was a very recent study that actually looked at how individuals with math anxiety study. And this particular research project came from college students, and it illustrated that college students with high math anxiety spent less time practicing math problems in order to prepare for a math exam, and spent less time engaging in effortful study habits. So you can see collectively how all of these components end up in a vicious cycle that we're going to spend some time talking about. So already I've alluded to this relationship, and this relationship between math anxiety and math performance is particularly pertinent to our conversation today and to this conference in general. And we do know a bit about this relationship. And so I think it's really helpful to talk about the relationship between math anxiety and math performance when you're thinking about math anxiety. So there's a lot on this slide, and I'm going to unpack it all fairly succinctly and separately for you. So I'm also happy to answer questions about this as we proceed into our session and we have our Q&A session. But math anxiety is considered to be one of potentially the most impactful, effective components that impacts math achievements. There has been a consistent small to moderate negative relationship, and you can see the numbers here, 0.25, negative 0.25 to negative 0.40. The negative 0.25 is small to 0.40, which is medium or moderate. And it means that individuals with higher math anxiety is associated with lower math achievement. So higher math anxiety, lower math achievement. That's what this relationship is referring to. We have actually 5 meta-analyses that have been conducted examining this relationship, and they've looked at all these correlational studies. Publication of these started in the 1990s, but 3 of these publications have been in the most recent 4 years. So much of this data is very new. So we have some confidence in looking at what this relationship looks like. We know that this relationship is consistent across the lifespan, and as we already mentioned, it can begin as early as age 6. We also know that this relationship is consistent across the gender spectrum, across racially and ethnically diverse samples within the United States, and across contents of origin, which is how culture was identified in some of these meta-analytic studies. So again, this relationship between math anxiety and math achievement is a global phenomenon, and it's persistently in this small to moderate negative range. But we do know that magnitude of that relationship, how strong the relationship between math anxiety and math achievement is, varies. And it varies with several different factors and components that we're going to talk about today. It can vary by grade level. So for example, a stronger relationship has been found actually with secondary students and early elementary students. And there are several hypotheses for why that may occur. One of those hypotheses is that the math content area might matter. So negative relationships may vary according to whether students are working on basic number knowledge or algebra, whether it's the beginning of them learning a particular content area or topic, or whether they've known it for a while or been exposed to it for a while in their curriculum. Some researchers have suggested that entry-level schooling, so formal schooling in kindergarten grades 1 and 2, may be an especially important time for children in which they first observe their own achievement in math and form their motivational and effective responses. So there's a lot of ideas about what is going to impact this negative relationship that exists between math anxiety and math achievement. So there have been regular conversations about 3 factors associated with math anxiety, which can be a helpful framework for thinking about how math anxiety manifests. These factors include individual factors like genetics, working memory capacity, self-efficacy, self-concept, and motivation. They also include environmental factors. So here I'm going to talk mainly about educationally related factors, given our topic area of our conference. So in this case, it would be things like school culture, classroom atmosphere, and instructional tasks. And it could be interpersonal factors, which could be teacher expectations, teachers' math anxiety, and teacher self-efficacy. These variables are thought to interact together in the immediate learning process with one another. So collectively, these factors, along with math anxiety, can impact performance, of course, as we've been talking about, learning behaviors, how students engage in the learning environment, or choices that students are making. So we've already talked about choices of advanced math classes and then careers. And as a result, of course, it can have a long-term impact on students' outcomes. So as an example of how these factors interrelate, we can think about educators' own math anxiety and how it can impact students' experience with math. And that can be demonstrated, of course, when there's a fixed mindset. So their individual is believing that the ability to do math is more innate than is acquired. And it can be expressed when positive attitudes towards math are not modeled. The characteristics of math facts are also impactful on how math anxiety affects students. Math anxiety more strongly impacts students' math performance when they're completing math tests that are difficult and weigh more heavily on their grades. And the cultural background of a student can shape math anxiety. Although math anxiety is experienced globally, in high-stakes academic cultures, there are different displays of math anxiety or levels of math anxiety, and gender stereotypes about math can also contribute to math anxiety when students internalize them. So there's a lot of ways in which each of these factors can relate to one another in context. Knowing that these factors exist, though, and that there are these categories that we can think of as a framework, offers us an opportunity to think about how we can mitigate math anxiety, especially when considering those factors that are most malleable and the factors that we can actually address on our own in the educational environment. So I wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about these factors and what we know actually impacts that relationship between math achievement and math anxiety. So the first factors I'm going to talk about are the things that actually we know strengthen the relationship between math achievement and math anxiety. In other words, these factors are more likely to make it be the case that students experience high levels of math anxiety and low levels of math achievement. So we know the magnitude of this relationship is stronger for complex computation or advanced math topics with multiple skills, more so than engaging in foundational basic math skills. We also know that math measures impact students, that math measures or tests that impact students' grades or tasks that impact students' grades are more impactful on this relationship as well. And what's interesting about that is it means that the high stakes testing environment hasn't been proven to strengthen that relationship. It's actually what the tasks and activities that students engage in the classroom that impact their grades. And what's interesting about this, when you look at some of the data out there, and you've looked at some of these meta-analyses and some of what they've been able to analyze with all of the data they have, is they've been able to demonstrate that when students are asked about things like negative expectations and self-deprecating thoughts related to math stimuli or situations, or when they ask about the process of learning in math, students exhibit higher math anxiety responses. So it's very much about engaging in task situations and the process of learning math that seems to be eliciting math anxiety. We also know that math anxiety is impacted by students' perceptions of the quality of math instruction that they're receiving, their teachers' confidence in math, and mirroring the data that we talked about earlier in that survey where teachers were saying, hey, classroom math anxiety as a whole is a problem in my classroom. That in turn turned out to be the case in these meta-analyses, which demonstrated that the average student's math anxiety at the classroom or even the school level has an impact on individual students' math anxiety in general, and then impacts math achievement overall. So I think when we start to look at not just the relationship between math achievement and math anxiety, but when we also start to think about what are the things that are impacting math anxiety, we can start to think about how we can fix those things. So these results really suggest that the nature of the instructional tasks, as well as the instructional quality and teacher affect, may be related to student math anxiety, which gives us a lot to work with in the classroom in order to provide supportive environments. For a minute, I'm going to actually take a deeper dive into instructional tasks, and I am going to do that because my colleagues and I had the opportunity to collaborate on a project that was looking at a couple different aspects of task difficulty. So I thought it would be interesting to share these results with you. We looked at simple and complex math tasks with 4th and 5th graders. So these tasks, simple task that was identified was single digit multiplication facts, and the complex math task you can see on your screen is a 3x3 digit addition problems with regrouping. And we also looked at timing. So we engaged students in overt and covert timing conditions. So our overt timing condition was that we told students of the time limit, the timer was visible and the timer made noise. The covert timing condition, they were not told the time limit, time was kept on the iPhone out of sight, and there was no noise. So those are the task variables that we manipulated in our experimental study. And it's important to note that there haven't been as many experimental studies on what actually can impact or change the relationship between math anxiety and math achievement as there have been correlational studies. So what did we find? What we found was that there were no differences in math performance according to math anxiety level when students were engaging in overtly timed tasks. We also found that students reported higher math anxiety when completing complex computation problems. And at this point in time, you should say, hey, you know what? That makes sense because Robin just talked to me about that and said that these meta-analyses demonstrated that math anxiety tends to be higher when students are engaging in more complex, challenging tasks. We also found that students with medium or high initial math anxiety reported higher math anxiety when completing those complex math problems, but especially when they were in the covert timing condition. So when they didn't know when the task was going to end, they exhibited more math anxiety. And then we also found a positive medium to high correlation between math anxiety and perceived task difficulty. So in other words, if a student perceived the task to be difficult, then math anxiety was reported to be higher. Also, an interesting finding was that the low math anxiety group demonstrated greater performance on the complex math problems under the overt timing condition. So for these upper elementary students with low levels of math anxiety, overt timing actually appeared to facilitate math performance with complex math problems. Okay. So we've talked a lot about the relationship and the factors that seem to be associated with the relationship between math anxiety and math achievement. We've also talked about a lot of the different factors, or 3 different factors, and the different types of factors within those categories that can impact math anxiety. It's also important to understand the theories that are associated with math anxiety. So there are 3 main theories about this relationship. One theory suggests that poor math performance leads to higher math anxiety. That's sometimes referred to as the deficit theory. Another theory suggests that math anxiety or cognitive worry interferes with math performance, and that's often referred to as the cognitive interference theory. And the third theory is the reciprocal theory. The reciprocal theory suggests that there may be a bidirectional or reciprocal relationship between poor math performance and experiences that may lead to math anxiety, and vice versa, that math anxiety may lead to poor math experiences and performance. So if I'm going to give you a little bit of detail about each of these theories so that you have a better sense of where they came from and what they are talking about when they're describing what they think is happening between math anxiety and math performance. So for the deficit theory perspective, it's considered to be poor number processing that results in negative encounters with math tasks, which leads to anxiety in future experiences. So students with poor math performance may participate less in math class, and this math avoidance in turn decreases cumulative learning opportunities that students have to practice and improve their math skills. So they continue to have poor math performance, and then that perpetuates feelings of math anxiety. The cognitive interference theory, as we just mentioned, also refers to the debilitation anxiety theory, the processing efficiency theory, or the disruption model. It proposes that high levels of math anxiety lead to poor math performance. Specifically, that negative thoughts, ruminations, and worries about math failure are purported to diminish cognitive capacity, especially working memory, and hinder math performance. So under this theory, students' low working memory interferes with their math performance, raising math anxiety and lowering math enjoyment. The reciprocal theory tends to have the most evidence thus far, and it proposes that bidirectional relationship. But we know that this relationship might not be uniform. So there is some evidence to suggest, and that evidence is growing, that it's more likely that early math performance is going to affect later math anxiety more than the reverse. So I like to look at it in this way. All of these theories suggest that children and youth with, if we start with poor math performance, we're going to say children and youth with weak math skills may enjoy math less, be less motivated, engaged, and confident in math tasks, and therefore avoid math tasks, which means that they are less likely to be engaged in math learning opportunities, and then they experience math anxiety and apprehension in engaging in math tasks. So you can see that there's this cycle. If we think about the cycle occurring with math anxiety as a starting point, then we can see the same things are happening, right? Students are going to enjoy math less. They are less motivated to engage in confidence. They avoid math tasks. They engage in fewer learning opportunities, and they display poor math performance. So when we think about which one is the starting point, it almost doesn't matter as much as we can see that the parts that we need to address are the same, right? We need to address math enjoyment, motivation, engagement, confidence. We need to make sure students are engaging more often in math tasks and have lots of opportunities to practice engaging and learning. So it's the parts in the middle that are exactly the same. Now, if this relationship is indeed reciprocal, then it means potentially that our intervention approaches should remediate both math skill deficits as well as address math anxiety. So that brings us to the point at which we are going to have a conversation about mitigating math anxiety in the classroom. So we've already talked about that. The environmental situation, both instructional tasks and the instructional classroom itself, can be impactful on whether or not math anxiety is manifested with students. So at the basic level, it's important to determine if students experience math anxiety. So we might consider using universal screening for math anxiety. We also want to make sure that we understand students' math strengths and weaknesses. So we want to have good understanding of universal screening in math in general. And then we want to make sure that we're able to monitor students' progress. So of course, being able to engage in universal mathematics screening with fidelity using reliable and valid tools is much easier to identify. And we can do that by looking, for example, at the National Center for Intensive Intervention. It is a little bit more challenging to identify an effective math screening tool. You can use one item questionnaires. So for example, on a scale from 1 to 10, with 10 being the most anxious, how math anxious are you? Although with adolescents, that one item scale has been shown to be a little bit less sensitive than when used with younger children. You could also use a brief scale. There's a 9-item scale called the Modified Abbreviated Math Anxiety Scale by Carey and colleagues from 2017. So that's another potential option. And you could also think about first universal screening students in math and then using the math anxiety scale as an additional diagnostic tool when you identify students continuing to display more intensive challenges in math. So that's how we can begin. I'm going to talk about 6 ways that we can produce supportive math classrooms. And I think that's really important. We have a lot of data that's converging in the same places, which gives us some good sense of what we can do in the classroom to make the math classroom be supportive for all students and to mitigate math anxiety, especially if we're seeing that classrooms on the whole or in general are displaying high levels of math anxiety. So the first thing that we can do is provide supportive skill practice on tasks that incrementally increase in difficulty as children master their prerequisite skills. We want to make sure we're providing explicit instruction that is scaffolded to advance students' learning. We can also talk about this as mastery learning. We also want to include fluency building tactics in core instruction every day. So this was a recommendation that was made a long time ago when talking about RTI in math. That was a document that came from the Institute of Education Sciences, which came from the U.S. Department of Education in 2009. And we know that accuracy is only one aspect of skill development. For example, the research indicates to us that students need to be both accurate and fluent with simple and complex computation in order to access and to engage in higher level math content. So we know that both accuracy and fluency are predictors of algebra, fraction knowledge, and word problem solving. And we also know that fluency with fractions is a critical underpinning for algebra. So these activities, when we talk about fluency building activities, we're talking about activities that should be used with students who are displaying high levels of accuracy. So somewhere around 90% accurate in the skill, and they are able to solve these problems independently with that high accuracy. That's when we want to start using those fluency building activities. We want to avoid tactics that during acquisition. So acquisition is the phase of skill development when students are just learning about this concept or this skill. So we want, when students are first approaching a content area in math, we want to avoid tactics that leave students to figure it out on their own. And we want to save those challenging tasks for students who have mastered the fundamentals of the concept or skill. And we want to provide them with some novel opportunities to utilize all their prior learning. So I'm going to unpack the reason why I think these are 4 supportive practices that we can do in the classroom that are helpful. And I'm going to do that by talking about the instructional hierarchy. This is also referred to as a learning hierarchy. There are 4 stages of step in the instructional hierarchy or the learning hierarchy, and each of those is aligned with instructional tactics for skill development. So in the acquisition phase, we're really talking about students who are working on building accuracy in their responding. They're learning about the concept and skill. Fluency are students who display accuracy, but they're slow, they're not very efficient in their responding, and they're building that efficiency. Generalization is talking about transfer or enduring these skills or concepts in order to respond in different math situations, tasks, or over time. And then adaptation is when students are able to apply the skills and concepts that they've learned, transfer them and integrate them when they are given novel problems. And each of these is aligned with different instructional tactics that can support that learning development area. So when it comes to acquisition, we want to use a lot of modeling, demonstration, think alouds, guided practice, immediate error correction. We want to teach smaller slices of a concept or a skill and provide a lot of concrete examples. When students are building fluency, we want to offer them more opportunities for independent practice, feedback on speed and accuracy, self-monitoring and graphing, peer practice, as well as timed practice opportunities. When it comes to generalization, again, we're talking about transferring those skills. This is when we want students to combine what they know. In recently learned or newly learned concepts, we want to use cumulative review. We wanted to ask students to solve problems in many different ways. We want to use team-based activities and math games. And when it comes to the adaptation stage, we want them to engage in novel, challenging problems and stimulations. So that idea of the instructional hierarchy is where those first 4 ways that we can support students' learning comes from. The last 2 ways to generate supportive math classrooms for students that have high levels of math anxiety or just math anxiety exists in some level in your classroom environment is to use language that focuses on students working hard to improve their own performance each day or showing their growth in their own performance each day. And so for this one, this is when we're really talking about tackling this idea of how do we think about math culturally. You know, in the United States, we talk a lot about math in a negative way. We say, well, I'm not good at math, and that's kind of a regular thing that everybody says. So we want to be aware of the words that we're using and how we're talking about math being portrayed in popular culture and whether or not that's in our classroom environments. We also want to, and I think this is where sometimes we stop at the language using. So we provide supportive language in the classroom to make sure that students are thinking about growing and they can make mistakes and that's okay. And that we want to make everybody a math learner, right? Everyone can do math. But we don't always go to this last part, which is involving students in their own learning. And I think this might be the real difference maker in how students start to gain more self-efficacy and improve self-concept on math is when we start to involve students in their own learning, have them reflect on what they learned and work towards achievable and short-term goals. And I'm going to unpack this idea in the next several slides. So according to the results from the Program for International Student Assessment data, so I had mentioned that PISA data earlier when we were having our conversation because we're getting a lot of information on math anxiety in this international community data. And so what we were able to learn from these data is that 2/3 of students worldwide actually already display a growth mindset, which is really good news. It means that we don't have to focus as much on student growth mindset, although we want to still be cognizant of that, as I just mentioned, and using and creating supportive language in our classrooms. But these data also suggested that teacher support was the difference maker in whether or not students' performance improved. So it was that combination that really mattered. And in the PISA data, this support was defined as adapting lessons to the needs of students, providing individual help, showing interest in the learning of all students, providing meaningful feedback on performance, and demonstrating how the student can improve. So praising effort, rewarding process and progress, and illustrating goals and strategies to achieve that goal. So we want students to be able to see math problems as challenges that can be mastered with effort. We want students to be able to persist when they are faced with math problems. And the best ways that we can maybe do that are by modeling effort and persistence in the face of math tasks, providing lots of feedback to help students master skills and concepts. So in addition to, of course, encouraging students, even in the face of mistakes, we want to show them or give them specific feedback on how to make accurate judgments of their own performance. And we want to provide them with new strategies or approaches in order to achieve their math goals. So it's not just that we want to provide them feedback on, oh, keep going, you're doing a great job, good effort. We also want to illustrate for them, hey, have you tried to work it this way? Or have you started that way? Or what are the other strategies or approaches that you could use in order to solve that problem? So giving them some keys and specific feedback. There's also been a lot in the literature actually on facilitating teamwork. So teamwork was defined as mutual assistance or encouragement and commitment. And when the offshoot or the benefit of teamwork, in addition to improved math performance, which I'm going to describe in a moment, is that students also display improved pro-social skills. So there's a lot of benefits for this teamwork idea. But through teams, we can see that there is a success in math. So one of the meta-analyses that exists on math outcomes by Pellegrini and colleagues suggested that students had a lot of success when they were engaging in teamwork, and it illustrated that we may be facilitating motivation and making students active learners by helping them to engage in teams. The other data that I think is really compelling is the NAEP data from 2017. 8th grade students working in pairs or small groups daily actually scored higher on the NAEP in 2017 than their peers. So there's some really high outcome data that has illustrated the benefit of working in pairs and small groups on a daily basis. And that data was shown in that middle school arena. So we mentioned that feedback is really important. So the amount of feedback and the type of feedback that we're providing is going to be useful and meaningful in these classroom environments. So we can provide students with praise on effort of engagement and persistence and use of efficient and effective strategies. Students can self-chart and score goals, so they can work towards a goal and then they can see how they're achieving that goal. We can give them choices in the classroom on the order in which they are presenting or engaging in math tasks, or if there's multiple ways that they can engage in a particular math concept or task, that we can offer them a choice of how they want to do that. I think one of my favorite ways to think about how to change or address the amount and salience of feedback is to think about goal reflection. So asking students, what did you enjoy most about what you did in math today? Did you meet your math goal? What are the barriers that maybe got in the way? How would you address those barriers in the future? What can you do next time? What are the things that you are really proud of that you learned today? Or what do I want to do better next time? What do I want to know more about or do more with? And then how am I going to do that? Another way to capture that same thing at the class-wide level is to do what's sometimes referred to as a ticket out, which are 3 things that I learned in math class today are, and have students individually respond and keep a journal of what those things are. Another way to talk about this notion of supportive classroom environments and involving students in their own learning is using the term self-regulation. Self-regulation is about helping students become aware of how they think when problem solving. And often we use heuristics and mnemonics and verbalization to teach students how to plan, monitor, and modify their own work. One of the things we know about students is that they are not as persistent on their tasks, and they are choosing to engage less when they have high levels of math anxiety. So if we can teach them how to plan, monitor, and modify their work, we can address those issues. Another way we can talk about self-regulation, or others talk about self-regulation, is using the term metacognition or metacognitive strategies. So there again is data at the middle school level that's showing that students who received metacognitive strategy instruction, so instruction that helps them think about how to plan, monitor, and modify their own work, outperformed peers who received typical math instruction. And this was also true for students with math learning difficulties and disabilities. In fact, these data showed that metacognitive strategies increase understanding and the ability of students to solve math problems when they are using these types of strategies, even if they struggle with math. So if we think about all of these elements together, we can think about feedback that we're providing, the support we're giving, the self-regulation and metacognition components. We can put them or layer them into our math classes when we're providing that skill and concept building. We can praise effort and persistence. We can establish short-term learning goals. We can offer opportunities for reflection. We can teach students to monitor their own progress towards individualized learning goals. We can show students how to record their own learning accomplishments and encourage them to check their own work. So hopefully you have some ideas and strategies for what we can do to address math anxiety at the whole classroom level based on the factors that we know influence the relationship between math anxiety and math performance. I also wanted to have the opportunity to talk with you about students who have high levels of math anxiety and how we can design individualized interventions to address those students' needs. And of course, I want to talk about a caveat whenever we're providing individualized supports to students, we want to make sure that that class-wide environment is the best class-wide environment we can establish, and we can use best practices, because we know in the MTSS structure that the students that struggle the most are going to benefit more from those intensive interventions if that classroom structure is supportive. So these interventions are designed to be for students with high levels of math anxiety. And of course, we want to make sure that they are also participating in classrooms that are supportive. So I'm going to begin here because, again, if we think about what do we know in the literature about interventions that directly address math anxiety, the answer is not as much as we hope to, I think, in the future. And so my research team and I decided to investigate what are those interventions that do address math anxiety, and can we synthesize that literature and conduct a meta-analysis on that literature. And so we set forth to do just that. We found quasi-experimental or experimental studies that compared either what we categorized as a therapeutic or a math skill intervention with a control condition or another treatment condition. The outcome measure, the studies had to include a math anxiety outcome measure, and many of the studies also included a math achievement measure. These studies that we found were 17, so not a huge number of studies, and they represented 1,786 primary and secondary students. The math interventions that were comprised in this literature included tutoring, cooperative groups, study skill strategies, computer-assisted instruction, and math games. The therapeutic strategies were journaling, cognitive behavioral therapy in modular sessions, increasing self-concept, positive self-talk, breathing exercises, and relaxation techniques. On average, the sessions were delivered 50 minutes twice weekly for 8 weeks across all of these studies. So what did we find? So we found that when it came to the math anxiety outcome, the therapeutic interventions had a moderate effect size. So you can see that effect size on your screen of -0.51, which means that the math anxiety symptomatology decreased. And that, again, was a moderate effect size. And we also found that there was no impact on math performance. So that's that negligible effect size of 0.12. And that's probably not surprising. We don't necessarily think that therapeutic interventions are going to address a math outcome, but it is good news that these therapeutic intervention category was able to mitigate math anxiety. In terms of the math interventions that were delivered, we were able to illustrate that math performance improved. It was a moderate to large effect size of 0.76. So, and again, we might expect that outcome, right? If we're going to introduce a math intervention, we're going to hope that it's going to improve math performance, and in this case, it did. But the surprising thing was that math anxiety was also reduced. So there was a small effect size of -0.32, meaning again that the math anxiety symptomatology decreased when a math intervention was put into place. So for us, two key findings was that math anxiety was addressed better through therapeutic interventions than through math interventions, and math performance was addressed better by math interventions than therapeutic interventions, but that small impact on math anxiety when just receiving math interventions was notable. It's also really important to understand that this literature is smaller. We need more studies, and in particular, we need studies that are going to compare therapeutic interventions, math interventions, the combined interventions with a control condition. There are not that many studies that have actually endeavored to compare each of those conditions, and so that needs to be done in the future, in future research. but it does definitely give us a preliminary starting place for how do we address this problem for the students that have those high levels of math anxiety. So taken together and thinking about the theories that we've already discussed today, which seem to support a reciprocal framework, and given the results of this meta-analysis, here's what I would recommend to you in approaching addressing the individualized needs of students with high levels of math anxiety. I would begin with a math intervention informed by data on math skills, strengths, and areas to improve. Provide explicit instruction on when and how to use various math strategies. Incorporating fluency building on simple and or complex computation, as well as fractions and other areas, depending on where the student is struggling. I would also recommend including strategies to address math anxiety, and we're going to unpack those recommendations next. So to support the students with math needs supporting the math needs of students with math anxiety, we are going to do two things. We are going to address their math needs, and we are going to address the math anxiety. So we're going to start with math needs. So one of the things this practice guide, this is from the Institute for Education Sciences, Department of Education. It was published in March 2021. Talks about elementary students because that's where we have the data. But in my own experiences, the students in the middle school level that are struggling in math are experiencing many of the same struggles as students at the elementary level. So these 6 elements are useful regardless of whether the students are in elementary or in middle school. And I will have a specific recommendation for middle school in a moment. But the idea is that each of these 6 components has very strong evidence and should be utilized when designing interventions or when evaluating existing interventions in the area of math. So we want to use systematic explicit instruction. We want to teach clear and concise math language, which I'm sure you may have attended other sessions at this conference that talk specifically about the strategies you should employ for that. We want to make sure you're using concrete and semi-concrete representations to support students' math learning, as well as number lines. We want to teach schematic ways to understand word problems, which again, probably you may have attended some sessions on that earlier in this conference, and then including regularly timed activities. So those are the 6 strategies that you want to ensure are in the intervention approaches that you're using with these students. And here is my specific tip that has been illustrated more with older students. So for those of you who are looking for specific middle school recommendations. So I usually ask this question, instead of just providing the answer to this, I usually ask, what do you think is better? Asking for students to provide solutions to all 8 problems that are presented to them, or interleaving 4 worked problems with 4 problems that require solutions. You already know the answer because it's on the screen, but research has shown that students actually learn more deeply and are more successful when examples are interleaved between problems. So what do we mean by that? What we mean is we're going to provide or interleave worked and partially worked examples for students. So in this example, I'm going to illustrate the same problem presented 3 different ways. So this is a standard problem without an answer, right? This next problem that just popped up on the screen is a worked problem. So it's a fully worked problem that a student is expected to study. And then we have a partially worked problem in the middle. So if you were interleaving problems, you would present perhaps 1 or 2 of each type. So for example, 2 worked problems, 2 partially worked problems, and 2 unworked problems. And those problems could be all different. And the intention is for students to be able to have the opportunity to see and study how the problem actually works, then to solve it themselves partially, and then to solve it themselves fully. The other component that I think is useful across students, whether it's elementary or middle school students, is creating a checklist. Now, the checklist that you see here is a simple checklist. It is provided by the Iris Center as an example for an elementary level checklist, but they also have a secondary level checklist on the Iris Center as well. I think great thing about the checklist is that we know that students with math anxiety exhibit challenges engaging in the math task and persisting on the math task. We also know that checking work is not something that students prefer to do, as we heard when we talked about those students, college students who did not want to engage in more intensive effort, right, when it came to studying and homework. So individualizing these checklists can be really useful. We can identify checklists for various types of problems. We can include the common errors that students tend to make in these problems as an item on the checklist. We can list the appropriate step so that we can prevent errors and compile each of these items as a self-check item into a list. You can generate these self-monitoring checklists, or you can have students generate these, but altogether having a checklist on how to solve a problem, how to approach it, how to work through it, and how to check it is really useful for students in general, but of course, students with math anxiety too, it's going to be a very helpful tool. You can even put a bunch of these on a keychain. Students can sort through these and use them as a tool as needed. So again, if we think about going back to that supportive classroom environment and thinking about how do we help students reflect on their own learning, this is another way to help students reflect on their own learning and give them some structure around it. The last part of what I want to talk about in terms of mitigating math anxiety for those that have high levels of math anxiety, so that these are the students that you're creating individualized interventions for, is we want to reduce those math anxiety symptoms. And we're going to do that with therapeutic interventions, but I'm going to provide you with some ideas that can be done without a mental health support professional. And then I'll also talk about some strategies that might be better used by a school psychologist or a school counselor or a social worker, your support staff that are available to you. So let's start by talking about strategies that have been utilized in classrooms or with students before engaging in a math task. The first one is journaling. It's called journaling, or it's sometimes called expressive writing. It reflects 15 to 20 minutes of free writing about students' thoughts and feelings regarding the math stressor that's upcoming. So it might be solving math problems. And they're going to do that before they engage in that math task. The research suggests that writing about a stressful or emotional event, especially in math, after several bouts of writing can minimize that math anxiety. We can also do relaxation training. So my research team and I have done a couple of pilot studies looking at relaxation training in the context of solving math tasks. And this is one example. So in this example, you are going to pretend you're squeezing a whole lemon in your left hand. You're going to squeeze it hard. You're going to try to squeeze all the juice out, feel the tightness in your hand and arm as you squeeze. Then you're going to drop that lemon and relax. And then you're going to see how much better your hand and arm feel when they are relaxed. So you're going to start with hands and arms. You're going to proceed to shoulders and neck, and you're going to also include legs and feet. In some of our preliminary work, students did feel more relaxed with relaxation training, but they did not prefer it to the next one I'm going to talk about, which is breathing. So breathing tended to be the preferred strategy of the two that we tried, which were breathing and relaxation training. And this is called square or box breathing. This is a common breathing method. You can Google this method. There's a number of different ways you can look at or use this tool. You can actually have a square that students can trace. So in this case, we're saying place your finger in the bottom left corner of the square. Trace your fingers along the square as we practice our square breathing. Slowly breathe in through your nose for a count of 4. As you breathe in, trace a line with your finger along the side of the square. Hold your breath for 4 seconds. Trace the line going down. Slowly exhale as you trace the line again for 4 seconds. And then hold for another 4 seconds as you draw one last line in the square. So you can trace a box like this, or you can draw an actual square. Breathing exercises have the advantage of being embedded into a math task or being conducted before a math task. But the previous 2 strategies that we talked about, which are journaling or expressive writing and relaxation training, all have to be done before engaging in that math task. The square breathing can actually be done throughout the math task. So that is one advantage. And we have practiced doing both the breathing and the relaxation training in brief 5-minute sessions. The other area that was illustrated in the studies that were in our meta-analysis included trying to have students engage in positive self-talk. So this can consist of writing a worry or a feeling from a previous experience when completing math problems and transforming that feeling into a positive statement. The other way to talk about it is to reframe those physical symptoms of anxiety that students may experience, so sweaty palms and rapid heartbeat, as a sign of excitement or readiness to compute math problems as opposed to a sign of worry. There, of course, are other strategies that can be utilized that would be ideally done by a school support professional. So those include cognitive behavior therapy. So there's one acronym that I think is great for kids, which is KICK, knowing I'm nervous, icky thoughts, calm thoughts, and keep practicing. Dialectical behavior therapy and exposure therapy. And I want to give you just a brief synopsis of what each of these entails, just so you have some background knowledge related to it. The American Psychological Association explains that cognitive behavioral therapy is helpful in addressing several beliefs, such as unhelpful ways of thinking and behaving, and how that can lead to psychological distress, that people can learn more beneficial ways of thinking and behaving, and that new habits can relieve the anxiety that students are experiencing with math. When it comes to dialectical behavior therapy, which has also been suggested as a possible tool to utilize for math anxiety, this therapy combines elements of behavior therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, and mindfulness. It's dialectical because it refers to addressing two opposing ideas, which is the acceptance and the reality of this math anxiety, and changing the situation or changing how those anxiety feelings are operating. And then finally, we have exposure therapy. And in an exposure therapy, a person will have exposure to the math stimulus or situation that triggers the worry for them. And over time, that controlled exposure reduces their feelings of anxiety and distress. So those are other specific therapeutic techniques that can be utilized that are more likely to be done in an isolated setting as opposed to sort of embedded within your math intervention setting. So when we're thinking about some of these combinations of strategies, I mentioned earlier, we can talk about intensifying our math intervention for students with high math anxiety to address their skill deficits. And we can utilize some of these briefer strategies, relaxation, breathing, expressive journaling, as part of that math intervention process. And I think it's important to think about how we can make those combinations as opposed to delivering these two techniques in isolation, because we know it's about the math situation, math task, and the process of learning math that makes students anxious. So making sure that we can support that student learning is going to be really helpful. So as we come to a close in our session, I would love for you to have some reflections on how well is your classroom designed to mitigate math anxiety? What of the strategies that we talked about today already are occurring in your classroom or in your school setting? What could you easily do when this semester begins next fall to make some adjustments in your classroom environment in order to promote a more supportive environment in math? And then how are you, or how have has your school or your colleagues talked about meeting the needs of students with high levels of math anxiety? What would you like to do? How would you like to address it? What are the first steps you would like to take in doing each of those elements? So I'm going to end there, leaving us with those reflections as we move into our question and answer session.
Dr. Cotting, I just wanted to let you know that I opened the chat up. And for everybody else, if you have any questions, you can enter them into the chat. As we're waiting to do that, there was a question that came through to me that I wanted to share. And that was in reference, I believe near the beginning, you discussed that you were doing a study that involved covert timing, where you were hiding the stopwatch from students. And so the question was, when you were studying covert timing, did students still know that they were being timed and just couldn't see the watch, or did they not even know that they were being timed?
Yeah, great point. They did not even know they were being timed. Yeah, that was really important for us to be able to monitor. And we suspect, although we would need more studies to confirm this, that was why when they were engaging in that complex, challenging task, that that some students exhibited more anxiety because they were unaware of how long they would have to engage in that complex task.
Another person asks or states that mathematical mindsets are a big topic in their district right now, and they're wondering just your thoughts about that and what does the research say?
Yeah, so I guess I need a follow-up. I don't know if this person can send a follow-up and let me know what they mean by mathematical mindset. I think as a general idea, it sounds like a good plan, right? We want to have students that think about math and engage in math. I think one of the things we have to be cautious of is that we need students to be able to understand fundamentals of math in order to do higher level challenging content. And so I think we need to, that's why I was asking sort of, what do we mean by mathematical mindsets?
She did reference, she's talking specifically about Joe Bowler's work.
Okay. Yeah, so I think when I think I talked a little bit about how we produce mathematical mindsets. I think when you look at the existing literature and you're talking about it from students that are entering into a classroom not feeling very comfortable about math, or even if you think about I was referring earlier, I didn't mention the author's name, it was Gunderson and colleagues who've done a lot of work in math anxiety and math motivation space. They do a lot of work where they're talking about making sure that we're providing supportive environments where we are scaffolding for students, we're helping them to be successful in math, and when they're successful in math, then they want to engage in more math. And so I think those are really good ways of thinking about and approaching how we engage students in math. We can see from these data that exist now that if we do the standard status quo, we are actually going to facilitate math anxiety. So we already heard if there's a high level of math anxiety in the classroom, if we don't have supportive adults who believe in math and think they can do it, right? If we are giving students way too hard or challenging tasks that they don't have the background for, we're more likely to facilitate math anxiety than if we scaffold, support, have students be involved in their own learning. And I hope that that's kind of the takeaway that you got. I know I tried to break it all down. So I hope that me responding to this question helps to kind of put that back together in a smaller nugget that's easier to maybe think about.
We had another question, but I know you've discussed it, but maybe just kind of pinpoint this one. How does teachers' self-efficacy impact students' math attitudes?
Yeah, so I'm the literature that I was referring to earlier talks a lot about that. There are Luttenberger and colleagues. I think there's another study by Lee and colleagues that have talked about how there is one of the most direct impacts is teacher self-efficacy in math has a direct impact on how students feel about math. And so I think that's an important thing to think about. In the research world, we actually separate out all the different ways that we can feel about math, self-concept, self-efficacy, motivation separately. So just generally speaking, there is data to say that for sure, one very large impact on students' perceptions of math comes from the self-efficacy of their teacher and the confidence of their teacher in engaging in math tasks.
And we had another question here about progress monitoring and timing of that. And is it helpful to show the timer and let the students know that they're being timed so that we're exposing them to that? Or is it more beneficial to hide that timer so that they don't know? Or do we do a little bit of both of that? Do you have any recommendations for a person doing progress monitoring with special education students?
Yeah, I really appreciate that really practical request. So Robin, you told me all the literature. Now, what is your exact recommendation, right? And here's what I would say about that. We know that accuracy is an important metric, but rate is an even more important metric about whether a student is mastering a concept. And rate-based measures are timed. So those would be things like curriculum-based measurement, right? So those timings can be 1 minute, 2 minutes. It depends on the application. Sometimes it's 8 minutes or 10 minutes. And I think we want to be using those timed metrics, and we want students to be able to engage in math efficiently as well as accurately. So it is important that we engage students in that fluent practice. timed practice, and we also want to progress monitor using those timed tools. I think it's fine for students to know that they have a set amount of time, and our data preliminarily says that if they know that set time, it's actually better than if they don't know that set time. So yeah, I would also make sure that when we are talking about fluency building, right, that we are doing that with tasks that students are already accurate with. So that's like I kind of merged two things there, but yes, yeah, you can show them the time. I think students really, our experience and the data suggests that students really do well with goal setting and seeing their progress. And we shouldn't be afraid to show that stuff.